Hi. Thanks for having me this morning or this afternoon. My name is Sam Simataa, and thanks again to the PNSQC committee for having me. After hearing about this conference and reading about the mission statement, I was really excited to be part of this conference just to learn from more people. I'm new to automation, and I've been not new to QA, but new to automation. So I was excited to sort of hear of what the fountain of knowledge is in this conference, and also with it being one of the longest standing conferences. I think it's 39th year. Some of the material that comes out of here gets disseminated into the broader community, whether it be through the website or different channels. So basically today, the old saying goes, don't reinvent the wheel. So this presentation aims to reflect on the existing wheel, if you want to think of it that way, and hopefully see some new in the old as I share my lessons learned from my first year as a automation test developer. So as the title of this presentation states, I'll be walking you through my takes on how to decide on test automation frameworks, how to grow in your automation knowledge, the importance of code organization and readability, and then as well as talking about collaboration. I'll then open it up for questions at that point. But before I do, let me just try and introduce myself. So my name is Sam Simataa, and I'm originally from a country called Namibia, which is in southwestern Africa. Just a little bit of history about that and the place. It was once a German colony and still has remnants of that era in terms of like architecture, culture, and even the language. However, Namibia also has five, major tribes and several languages as well. So as you can imagine, code switching is basically second nature to everyone, because you might have your best friend from one tribe, your teachers from another, you work with people from several tribes. And so it's sort of code switching is inherent to a lot of people. And so I was born and raised in Namibia, went to, as I said, quite a diverse primary school there. Then I was fortunate enough to gain a scholarship to go to the Mahindra United World College of India, which was a totally different world for me, never having left Namibia at that point. It was really just an interesting experience for me. After that, I had another opportunity to come to Luther College in the States, in a small town in Iowa. So that was also another adjustment from like big city in India to sort of this rural small town in Iowa. After graduating then, I worked in several places. I worked for a Fastenal company. I worked for a company called Preventus Technologies, and currently am at Mayo Clinic here in Rochester, Minnesota. And so I share this to give you a sense of my personal background, which will hopefully complement the story of my journey in software testing and the lessons I plan to share with you today. So in my tenure at Fastenal, I started out as a support analyst, so working on help desk tickets, support calls, emails. And over time, I found patterns in the calls I was receiving and started seeing how I could sort of mitigate some of these issues that the end users were facing a lot. And so over time, that led me to transition into business, to become a BA, a business analyst, and leverage those relationships that I had formed with these users to create more robust requirements, as well as just requirements for the new and existing products that we were supporting. Furthermore, it allowed me to also exercise effective gap analysis and provide more coverage in the user stories. So I was able to bring both sort of the technical requirements, but then also sort of this experience that I've had in these products. Eventually, the strong desire to advocate for the end user brought me to software testing, the products that I was involved with. And that's where I started doing a lot of manual testing, sort of understanding flows and trying to add coverage for those portions. Over time, I got pretty good at that. Now I wanted to sort of explore this more, and that's when I joined Preventus Technologies and continued that spirit of patiently and sort of aggressively rattling the systems under test. So as I reflect on the experiences from working at those two companies, I realized that there are several traits that make a good tester. So this is just a short list and is not exhaustive, but I thought were worth noting. So some of these that make up the software tester DNA. One, I think, is being a good and open listener. I think it's important to absorb as much information about a product and its users in order to be able to represent them and sort of create that persona and represent that persona that who use the software. I think being dismissive of scenarios can lead to misrepresentation of a population of end users, as well as also let things slip through the cracks. Two, being detail oriented. Even though testers have traditionally been the gatekeepers of software before the software is released, it is still important to make sure to dot all the I's, cross all the T's. Whether it comes to either testing or even the documentation that needs to accompany the product that's being released. Three, being patient. Even though deadlines always seem to loom overhead, being able to balance the pressure of speed and patience can allow us to catch elusive issues that may cause headaches down the road, especially once in production. That's a costly thing to the business as well. Being curious. I think this goes hand in hand with being patient. Because I think the curiosity helps create that balance between speed and patience by discovering more effective ways or effective areas to test the software so that it may yield more value or more issues, and you can address them at that time. And then lastly, I think, just the spirit of advocating for the end user. I think this is what makes testers special, and I think should be every tester's motto. Because by keeping the end user in mind, it ensures a higher standard of testing and hopefully a higher quality of software at the end of the software development lifecycle. So as I wanted to test software more, I ventured into automation and started looking up some things, and that's how I eventually got to Mayo Clinic as a automation test developer. My main role would be to test mostly web applications and build a automation test framework from scratch. So as you can imagine, I was quite excited, this being my first real experience with automation, and then also a change in profession. But I was overwhelmed with the number of resources and frameworks to choose from. However, it came very clear in the early weeks that, these traits, these software tester DNA traits, it should not be lost when transitioning from sort of a more manual testing domain to an automation testing domain. So it helped sort of smooth my transition out a little more. So how did those early days go for me? Most of the web applications I were testing were JavaScript based, using React and a couple other JavaScript development frameworks. And as we know, it's best practice to choose an automation framework that complements the language that the developers use. So fortunately, this narrowed it down to a couple automation test frameworks. However, the tough part came when we had to choose which framework to go with between these. Having little experience in evaluating frameworks, I turned to a technique that I use personally to make decisions between two or more decisions. So this decision framework that I use is called the decision matrix. It was invented by Stuart Pugh, and it allows you to do multidimensional evaluation of one or more options. So as you can see in the example here, I used the decision matrix to actually buy my first car. I could have chosen a car, depending on factors such as popularity, consumer reviews, or even what my colleagues were driving. However, the decision matrix forces you to choose criteria that are more relatable to your needs to make a more connecting match. It is advised you choose about 3 to 5 criteria that best compare the options. And so in this case, some of the criteria that I had were cost, style, fuel efficiency, transmission, and then transmission meaning like manual or an automatic, and then the car model. Yep. And then you would rank each criterion on a scale from 1 to 5, being 1 being when it's least you felt the least strongly about it, and then 5 being when I felt most strongly about it. So as you can see, the Mazda 3 kind of came out on top, and using this matrix made choosing a car more relevant and efficient for me. So I applied the same principle to test automation frameworks. So the frameworks that we chose to compare were WebDriver.io, Cypress, and Test Cafe, all Node.js end-to-end test automation frameworks. For comparison, we of course, the project requirements and constraints were taken into consideration. And after sort of looking over that, we were able to come up with 4 strong criteria, namely being browser compatibility, support documentation, tech complexability, and then extensibility. After weighing the criteria and scoring the options accordingly, Test Cafe came on top, mostly because the way it's extensible. And was just the logical framework at that time. So once we started looking at the framework, I asked myself, how do I get started with it? What do I have to do to get going here? One of the impressive points also with Test Cafe was its online documentation. Most tools have tutorials on their sites, and this is a great way to get started with it. Why? I think it allows you to go through their documentation, which can be a source of truth, and will also help you become familiar with the framework and how to, with its best practices, and also how to get help easier. I often thought of it as sort of learning a musical instrument. Learning and sticking to the best practices earlier can help yield better results and progress over time. It also allows you to get started with basic side projects and examples to then apply what you're learning. So sort of that learning from what you're learning approach. This transfer, of theoretical knowledge, what you're seeing, to the practical implementation really helps foster that best practices cycle, and hopefully it will transfer then, into your work projects. So once I started engaging with Test Cafe in this way, I started asking myself, well, okay, I'm kind of just playing around with these things. So how do I actually grow in my knowledge? Following the documentation and examples that were suggested by the website, helped build in those best practices that the creators of this framework, wanted us to learn. So in other words, it felt like, I was building up that muscle memory to be employed at a later time. So, but as there's the famous saying by Aristotle, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, because you're kind of learning all these other things as you go. However, the way I see it is the more you know, the more you know. And what I mean by this is, by being disciplined in growing this muscle memory, it allowed me especially to see the barriers in my learning and how I was grasping these concepts. And it also gave me a way to overcome these barriers. So for example, a barrier that I faced was being able to access some web elements and I didn't know how to assert against them. I was familiar with the use of XPath, but didn't know how to implement it using Test Cafe. So simple example here is going back to the documentation. I saw how I could use the Test Cafe syntax to traverse the DOM in an XPath-like manner to access any element and needed for any of the tests I needed. One of the biggest benefits of test automation, as I've come to find out, is regression testing. By using my increased knowledge of the test framework, I was able to write more comprehensive tests, I would say. Running them as regressions would find issues that have changed from build to build, and catching bugs in this way has also allowed me to create more valuable bug reports, mainly for 2 reasons. One, I was able to supply bulletproof bug reproduction steps, so no one could, refute me on that. And it also allowed me to create more comprehensive and robust automated tests, and add those, sort of grow those into the regression suite. One thing I learned at the time was when studying for my ISTQB test automation engineer exam, is that bugs are the best candidate for automation test results, or test suite, automated regression suites. So this then supports this claim that, addressing bugs caught through automation is a value add to the quality of the system. Being more familiar with the test framework syntax also allowed me to perform gap analysis and shift left testing in especially the sprint planning ceremonies. So, creating these valuable bug reports aided in like seeing where these gaps are, and were shown by these bugs that may have been missed by the developers or the business analysts. And then once I create that bug, I could capture it, and then we could put that back onto the requirement in subsequent automated tests. By doing shift left testing, which is, one tries to sort of test these abstract entities further up the software development lifecycle, sort of in the requirements gathering phase. I was also able to evaluate if and how user stories could be automated, and what automated needs and desires I had, such as, if I needed elements to be created or classes to be put in certain elements in order for me to test more efficiently. Communicating this earlier provided ease of automated when stories were ready for automation. However, the con to this is that shift left testing is sort of it really requires a paradigm shift, sort of mind shift of not only the testers, but the whole team, where both the tester and the rest of the development team need to promote this curiosity needed to discover the testing needs and efforts earlier on. Okay, so you go through the process of doing gap analysis and shift left testing, and you're almost ready to test. So once you have all you need for your tests, it was easy. It felt easy to just dive right in and start writing the tests. But I very painfully learned, in an agile world, change is constant, and change is the nemesis of test automation. Therefore, code organization planning, that idea became very, very important to me, and I started dabbling with that a little more. I found this out, the really hard way when I had to do like countless refactorings. So with good planning at the beginning, the automated tests morphed from sort of single entities to parts of a whole, which is kind of cool to see. So this is just a rough example here. So as we can see in this code snippet here, there's a test written in two ways, example 1 and example 2. The example 1 is an example of what I would say is bad code organization. We see that the first step is to log into an entity, and then the steps are added in the test itself. This may suffice if this were the whole test, but will become more complicated once tests and scenarios are added at a later time. Therefore, I think the bottom part is an example of good code organization, as it abstracts out that login functionality to a class that can be used for any other test that needs it. This action, can be classified as creating reusable code through creating page model patterns or page object patterns. Common methods and locators can then be abstracted to these page object files and then extended to any test that needs to use those methods or those locators. We also see in the top example, it has more steps. Even though it's easier to read because you can kind of follow the steps there, it can make for a larger test if you add more and more tests down the line. So by abstracting the login method, as seen in the bottom example, we can have a more succinct test with actionable steps, and then do an assertion to verify that the actionable steps have passed or failed. This kind of follows the structure of the traditional test case that has a step and expected results sort of format. So it also keeps the test files minimal and nice and tight, and just lets the tests do the tests. as opposed to navigation and all that stuff as well. So this I think the bottom example promotes a sort of a do not repeat yourself principle, because it allows you to abstract those parts, and then familiarity with the project, with both the project and the test automation frameworks, allows for abstracted pieces to be used more effectively. And that code reuse culture sort of comes into play. So you go ahead, write my code. Once the code is complete, I was fortunate enough to have a good Scrum team that believes in peer review. Through having more readable and organized code, reviewing pull requests, the step that usually take before merging your code into the main branch. Through having cleaner code, it was much quicker and cleaner to sort of explain or demo the code that I was trying to go through, and could parse through it easier as well. So enhancing these name conventions of abstracted classes, it helps in this regard, as it clarifies what the test is trying to do. So I thought pull requests and other forms of peer review have been great to foster collaboration in a team and a group in this way. So once we get to that part, how do we take that and go with that collaborative vibe? How do we take that further? I found this meme a couple of days ago, and I thought it was just really funny. How I always go to a developer and say, "Hey, this is not working," and they're like, "It works on my machine." I'm like, "Well, we're not shipping your machine, so I think we got to look at this." So I'm sure this has happened to all of us at one point, but I think the biggest gain to organizing code better is that it creates a natural sense of code readability. This comes in very handy when you're trying to demo code or ask for help when you're stuck, especially like in pull requests. Have been a great way for my colleagues to sort of look at my work and then critique my work and ask effective questions. Having readable code naturally allows reviewers to ask clear and more valuable questions that may enhance your code or expose vulnerable areas that might be valuable information for you as a tester, or even further back down the line for the stakeholders such as the BAs or the product owners. By creating this avenue for discussion, by creating an avenue for such discussion, can really set the bar also for like what kind of reviews and what kind of questions you're asking. I think that again can help create that sense of quality in the group or your team. I also like to believe at least, that striving for high code readability has helped in collaboration when either asking for help, trying to get to the core of an issue, or even propose new changes in my automation code, especially within my group or even between cross-functional teams. In my experience, that's I think creating this feedback loop has helped make me feel like a supported and even a competent tester, even from the beginning stages. So talking about this process, this is kind of what I landed on. So reflecting on my first year, especially in the pandemic, not being able to sort of just walk over to my coworker's desk, just sitting, just having to Teams them and stuff like that. I've had time to kind of sit with this process a lot because I've had to learn it by myself. And so this is the process that I've come about, and through this process, I think a profound sense of self-confidence has also grown from creating these lessons for myself. So, from these lessons, I noted down the following process for when learning a new technology that might seem overwhelming. Step 1, learn. Using the resources to choose and understand a technology better, whether this be for automation test or anything else, for unit testing or other sort of technologies. 2 would be implement, add value to a project by using the knowledge you've gained to find and develop a creative solution when like for example, in my case, automating UI portions of a user story. Then 3, organize, work smarter and not harder by planning and creating reusable components that can benefit a project in the long run, such as using page object models. Step 4, share the ups and downs. your progress, in order to let others know that you're willing to be collaborative and create those feedback loops. Because I think that's where real growth happens, when you're able to sort of learn from others. And then after step 4, it's repeat. Challenges arise that may be outside the scope of a technology we use, a user story. So repeating these 4 steps will help overcome some of those challenging barriers. Maybe in the step 4, someone suggests you use a new technology or look at something, and then you can start again. Step 1, learn about it, try and implement it using small side projects. Try and do a proof of concept and organize it in a clear way that you can then step 4, collaborate with someone and show them, hey, this is what I came up with and might be a viable solution. So, sometimes that might even say, hey, maybe this technology we're using doesn't work. We need to integrate something else. So those realizations may come out of those conversations. This cycle, I would say, personally has helped me become a more vocal and open team member, and it really continues to fuel my passions for QA, and reminds me that I always have to strive for quality over quantity. So yeah, thanks for listening to my presentation. Thanks again, Heather, for the introduction, and I hope you got some new insights here, and maybe a gateway into learning about automation. So I will hand it over to you, Heather, or any questions that there may be.
Perfect timing, Sam. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions. If anybody has some, feel free to either speak up or you can post in the chat. I'm monitoring that. I will tell you, Sam, I don't know if you can see the chat right now, but you're getting lots of love.
Oh.
People love your meme. There will be some stealing of that little guy.
Gotcha.
So
cool. Yeah.
Any questions from anyone? It's looking like that you were so awesome, Sam. No one has any questions.
Wow.
That means that means you got it all, and you got it all out there, which is wonderful.
If I may, this is Ying.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Hi. Automation a lot of time come down to and deciding whether it's worth it to automate. Can you comment a little bit about that in the face of kind of increasingly rapid, deployment of new services, and just kind of how best to balance different types of testing activities, automated or not, but automation obviously requires some additional investment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I was fortunate enough when I started out, we had a good amount of time to sort of do the initial investment of looking into the various automation frameworks, implementing it, and then sort of starting off with a fresh set of user stories in order to build up our test suite. But yes, once we get deadlines, and then it's like, well, I need a couple hours to test this story, but we need to push it to production right now. So how do you sort of handle that conversation? I'd say one thing that I have done is communicate. I think it's important to let. I think Eric said it really well this morning when he was talking about risk assessment. Really communicate what the effort is going to be needed and what the risk of not testing this entity with. Communicating that to managers to let them know that we might be able to meet the deadline, but we're going to have issues if we do. I think that's step number 1. Step number 2 is then having a conversation with you, and hopefully if you have some testers with you or maybe developers with you, saying how can we divvy this work up. I think as the Agile Manifesto talks about, it's sort of people over process, so really using the resources that you have in order to be as creative as you can and as efficient as you can. So that may include, if you have a partner, maybe saying, okay, let's look at the story. We might have to we might have to break this up into an automated portion and a manual portion. Can we sort of can I take a part of this? Can we do it together? Is this even worth it? And sort of taking that risk analysis and making the call from there, where if it's going to be worth it to sort of put that initial automation investment now, or maybe do the manual part now and then come do the investment of automation later. I think those are some of the conversations that you need to have, and that hopefully will give you a more relevant answer, which I think is important too. Is that I don't think there's a one way to do everything, like a one size fits all kind of thing. I think it's very much towards your team, and I think collaborating and communicating is what brings out those answers. I know Heather talked earlier today about team culture. So, being able to know what your team culture is and communicating, I think those answers will come out in that as well.
And you've got, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say thanks, Yi, for the question.
And you've got a couple more questions that have rolled in. One, Sam, were you programming as a QA, or did you learn when you were hired as an automated tester? So I think the question is, were you programming before you got the gig as the tester, or did you learn on the fly?
Yeah, I learned on the fly. There was existing frameworks that other teams had used, which from a different framework. And then there was really just the documentation. So I just had to go with it. And like I said, those side projects really helped sort of learn and then help me implement small sections. And then I would bring that into my work. So I guess over time, I just kept doing that cycle back and forth, and I was able to grow in that knowledge.
And then you've got one more. Did you automate tests in the same framework as that the application was written in?
Did I automate tests in the same framework
that the application was written in?
Yeah. So the no. So the framework that the developers used was React. So that's more geared towards development work, and then we use Test Cafe, which is more geared towards testing or automated UI testing in this case. We did put it into the same repository so we could ship it at the same time and be able to run it in our pipelines, so that the code could build, deploy to our servers, and then the tests would run right after in order to validate the builds. So even though it was not the same framework, it was in the same repository in order to make that CI/CD process efficient.
Any other questions for Sam? We still have a couple minutes left if anybody has any additional thoughts.
I have one question. This is Ying again. In kind of bigger systems and operations, often there's kind of this discussion about, well, should I put automation effort in automating kind of smoke tests? So when something new got rolled out, you can run it through and make sure that we can deploy without problems. Or we should do like happy path tests, so all the important workflows are checked out, or even more than that. I mean, how do you think the order of priority when it comes to automating testing?
Yeah. So that's the other thing about testing. There's so many types or techniques of testing something. I think one, it depends on sort of the experience that you have. You may have someone who's new. Unfortunately, I was not new to QA or testing, but I was new to automation testing. So I was able to come with the idea of, okay, well, we need to test what is valuable, and then we need to see what else we have time for. So when you just first look at what's valuable, that can then be broken up into various things, such as smoke tests, just to make sure that the page is up. For example, if let's take a UI, for example, the page is up, that maybe see a couple of toggles here and there. There's the end-to-end piece of it, of saying if it's connected to a different system, how do we is that process, the end-to-end, is that flow working? Then there's a negative test. Maybe there are a couple error messages that show up as we enter in invalid characters. So I think coming up with like as many scenarios as you can, and then categorizing them into those techniques for the valuable parts first. I think that's something that needs to be done. Then I would say you need to prioritize in terms of what is the complexity. And unfortunately, I think that all comes with experience. You might know that the smoke test is really important, because if we know that the page doesn't even load, there's no point in testing the other things. But other places may say, well, we don't have a UI. We just need to test that the end-to-end flows are working. So I think categorizing them and then having the conversation of what is the priority, because from one story to another, it might also shift. So I think that's an approach of categorizing and then prioritizing accordingly.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have time for one more short question if anybody has anything.
I think I see one in the chat. What are yeah. Oh, you can go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. What is your take on new tools implementing for a brand new framework?
Take on new tools.
So it's maybe
yeah. It took a long time to to kind of learn Test Cafe and try and figure it out and how it fits into my use case. But I think, at the end of the day, we need to find a solution that works. And so I think the investment of, we might not be able to fully take a new tool and develop it as much. So that initial investment of sort of in my wheel, if you look at that learn portion of really looking at what the tool is and figuring out if it is actually correct for you, because we might just want to go with the most hot tool out there, but it might be terrible for you. So I think spending time to just patiently plan and investigate if the tool is ready for you, I think that is what I would suggest you do, because that you would yield a more relevant value for what you're trying to do.